There is a prison sitting on the edge of San Francisco Bay. You can see it from the water. You can see it from the highway. For over 170 years, it has held the men California deemed too dangerous, too broken, or too irredeemable to ever walk free again. At its peak, San Quentin's death row held nearly 750 condemned men, the largest execution antechamber in the United States. More condemned inmates than the entire states of Florida and Texas combined. 750 men. Waiting. Some for decades. And inside that population, buried inside the administrative records and court documents and sealed case files, were names that define the outer edge of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. A man who walked into a sheriff's office carrying a severed human hand. A killer whose crimes were so methodical, so sadistic, that the full scale of what he did may never be completely known. A case that changed the laws of an entire state. And a father who drove his own children to the edge of a field and decided they would not survive the night. These are not rumors. These are documented facts. Court records. Trial testimony. Prison intake reports. Federal case files. What you are about to hear is verified. But here is what most people watching this have never been told. Several of these men arrived at San Quentin having already spent years, sometimes decades, fighting their convictions from inside other institutions. And in one case that sits near the end of this documentary, the full story of what happened after the arrest has been almost completely buried. Not suppressed. Just never told in full. You will hear it today. But before that, there is something else. Something that appears in the psychiatric evaluations of more than one man on this list. A documented pattern. A detail that investigators noted, that courts heard, and that corrections officers confirmed on the record. And it changes how you understand every single case that follows. You might think that a condemned man sitting on death row for 20, 25, 30 years has faded. That isolation does its job. That time neutralizes the threat. But according to prison psychological assessments and documented behavioral records filed with the California Department of Corrections, in multiple cases, it did not. The men on this list did not fade. Some of them escalated. 7 names. 1 prison. 170 years of walls that have held California's worst. This is their story.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
Wayne Adam Ford was born on December 3, 1961, in Petaluma, California, the second son of a German immigrant mother named Brigitte and an American father named Calvin Eugene Ford. According to documented accounts of his early life, the household was not a stable one. His parents divorced when he was 10 years old, a rupture that by multiple accounts left a lasting mark on the boy. Those who knew him in his youth described him as quiet, withdrawn, and emotionally fragile, a child who never quite found his footing after the family split. He dropped out of high school in the late 1970s and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, where he would serve for 6 years before receiving an honorable discharge in 1985. During his time in the military, he was regarded by most accounts as disciplined and functional, a man who could follow orders and hold himself together within a rigid institutional structure. But according to family statements and documented medical records, something had already begun to shift inside him years before his discharge. In November 1980, while he was still a young man of 18, Ford was struck by a drunk driver and left in a coma for 9 days. His family would later state in documented interviews that he was never quite the same person after that accident, that his personality changed, that his temper became volatile, that the quiet, withdrawn boy had been replaced by someone prone to bursts of rage he could not control. Medical records from this period reflect a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, a condition characterized by extreme emotional instability, explosive anger, chronic feelings of emptiness, and an impaired capacity for maintaining relationships. He was hospitalized multiple times during and after his military service as his psychological condition deteriorated. By 1985, according to documented reporting, he was discharged from the Marine Corps not because of his service record but because of his mental health. He had barely begun his adult life and already the institutional walls that had been holding him together were gone. What came next followed a documented pattern that investigators would later describe as a slow and methodical escalation toward catastrophic violence. In 1986, Garden Grove police arrested Ford for allegedly beating, raping, and robbing a sex worker. He was never prosecuted, a failure of accountability that, according to later court analysis, allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. In 1990, he was convicted of animal cruelty in San Clemente after shooting a dog to death in his backyard, for which he served a brief jail sentence. He married twice, and both marriages ended in divorce. His second marriage produced a son named Max, and it was the collapse of that relationship in the summer of 1996 that investigators and psychiatric evaluators would later identify as the final fracture point. When his second wife moved out and took their son with her, Ford moved into a trailer park in Arcata, California, and took work as a long-haul truck driver. The job gave him something that would later prove catastrophically significant: near total freedom of movement across state lines, a rotating geography of unfamiliar locations, and regular access to vulnerable women at truck stops and highway on-ramps across California and beyond. According to court records and prosecution testimony presented at trial, Ford began killing in 1997. His first confirmed victim was Cary Cummings, 25 years old. Her remains, a partial torso and left arm, were recovered from Ryan Slough near Humboldt Bay on October 17, 1997. For more than 2 decades she would remain listed as a Jane Doe, her identity unknown. It was not until June 2023, through a partnership between the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, the California Department of Justice DNA Lab, and a private forensic genealogy firm called Othram, that her identity was finally confirmed through investigative genetic genealogy. Cary Cummings had waited 26 years for her name to be attached to what had been done to her. Ford's second confirmed victim was Patricia Ann Tamez, 29 years old. According to trial testimony, Tamez was at the intersection of 6th and D in Victorville, California on October 22, 1998, when a man in a large black truck pulled up and offered her a ride. She got in. The following evening, 2 security guards patrolling the California aqueduct near Hesperia found her nude body floating in the water. An autopsy documented the full scale of what had been done to her. She had been bound, raped, struck on the head with a blunt object, had her back broken, been strangled, and had one breast severed from her body after death. The missing breast was not recovered at the scene. Ford's third confirmed victim was Lynette Dayon White, also 25 years old, killed on September 25, 1998, in Ontario, California, her body discovered near Lodi. His fourth confirmed victim was Tina Renee Gibbs, 26 years old, killed near Las Vegas on May 16, 1998, her body found near Buttonwillow, California on June 2, 1998. According to prosecutors at trial, all 4 women were strangled, subjected to post-mortem sexual violence, mutilated through dismemberment, and disposed of in waterways across multiple California counties. The prosecution characterized Ford as a sexual sadist who targeted what they described as small and more easily controlled victims, deriving gratification specifically from the infliction of suffering and dominance over those who could not resist him. Ford himself, in what would become one of the most documented and forensically analyzed self-surrender cases in California criminal history, walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department in Eureka on November 3, 1998, accompanied by his brother Rodney. According to the sheriff's account, Ford told them he had some evidence, reached into his coat, and produced a Ziploc bag containing the severed breast of Patricia Ann Tamez. He told investigators it represented, in his own words, just the tip of the iceberg. He then confessed to killing 4 women and told authorities he believed he would have killed again, that he was afraid, according to documented statements, that his ex-wife was next, and that his son Max would be left without either parent. San Francisco State University criminologist Mike Rustigan, speaking to the Associated Press in the wake of the confession, stated that Ford's act of self-surrender was, in his assessment, truly an exception in the annals of serial killers. Investigators who reviewed the evidence took a different view. When police examined the details of what Ford had actually done to each of his victims, the binding, the rape, the post-mortem mutilation, the careful storage of severed body parts, they concluded that a man who harbored even a fraction of genuine guilt could never have inflicted what these women endured. The courts would hear both arguments in full. Ford's trial was consolidated in San Bernardino County Superior Court. On June 27, 2006, a jury found him guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. In August 2006 he was sentenced to death. He has remained on California's death row ever since, housed at San Quentin State Prison. California has not carried out an execution since 2006, and Governor Gavin Newsom issued a moratorium on executions in 2019. As of the time this documentary was produced, Wayne Adam Ford sits in a cell at San Quentin. The man prosecutors called a sexual sadist, the man some journalists called the serial killer with a conscience, and the man whose first victim spent 26 years in a county record as a Jane Doe before anyone knew her name. The system he walked into willingly in November 1998 has held him for over 2 decades. Whether it will ever carry out the sentence it handed him remains, as of today, an open question. But inside the same walls where Ford waits, another condemned man arrived by a very different road, one that began not in California, but in the aftermath of crimes so extensive, and so systematically brutal, that investigators spent years unable to determine how many people had actually died.
He is what connects all 5 of these cases, and what the system has never fully confronted. In every one of these stories, McCallum, Davis, Willingham, Tucker, Robeson, the people who came closest to stopping an execution, or who ultimately did stop one, were not acting within the normal operation of the justice system. They were acting around it, through it, or in spite of it. It was a state innocence commission, not a court of appeal, that finally got Henry McCallum's DNA tested. It was an international chorus of voices, from a pope to a Nobel laureate, that slowed Troy Davis's execution by hours, not by days. It was an investigative journalist at the New Yorker, not a prosecutor's office, that brought the Willingham Fire evidence to broad public attention. It was a television personality and a religious broadcaster, not a legal body, that made the most prominent case for Carla Faye Tucker's clemency. And it was a state legislature using a parliamentary procedure that most legal scholars had never seen deployed this way, that put 90 minutes between Robert Robeson and a lethal injection. The system, in each of these cases, did not correct itself. It was corrected by people operating at the edges of it, or outside it entirely. And the system's response, in most cases, was to continue functioning as designed. Cameron Todd Willingham is the data point that cannot be argued away. He is the reason the question at the center of this documentary does not have a comfortable answer. Because if the forensic science used to convict him was unsound, and documented expert review suggests it was, and if he was telling the truth when he said he had tried to save his daughters, then the state of Texas did not execute a murderer in February 2004. It executed a father who had already lost everything. And the men who reviewed Gerald Hurst's report and chose not to act on it, and the board that voted against clemency, and the governor who signed the death warrant, are all still alive. They have never been required to publicly account for what the science later suggested about what they did. That is the system working as designed. That is what finality looks like when the question of innocence is not treated as the highest priority. 230 exonerations. That is the documented number of people who have been released from death row in the United States since 1973, after being found to be wrongfully convicted. More than 200 human beings who were, at some point, scheduled to die for crimes they did not commit. The number of people who were executed before the evidence of their innocence was found, that number is unknown. By definition, it may never be fully known. What we do know is this: the 5 cases in this documentary are not outliers. They are not aberrations in an otherwise reliable system. They are documented illustrations of structural problems that researchers, legal scholars, and investigative journalists have been cataloging for decades. Problems with eyewitness testimony. Problems with forensic science that was accepted before it was validated. Problems with interrogation techniques applied to people who are young, or intellectually disabled, or both. Problems with a post-conviction legal framework that treats finality as more important than accuracy. Henry McCallum is alive. Leon Brown is alive. Robert Robeson is alive, for now. Troy Davis is not. Cameron Todd Willingham is not. Carla Faye Tucker is not. The difference between those two lists is not always guilt or innocence. Sometimes it is luck. Sometimes it is timing. Sometimes it is a DNA test that someone thought to run, or didn't think to run, or ran too late. The machinery of death does not pause to ask whether it is pointed in the right direction. That has always been the job of the people watching it. People like the ones who reviewed these cases, filed the motions, wrote the reports, issued the subpoenas, and people like you, who spend 40 minutes trying to understand what is being done in your name. If this documentary made you think, there's another one waiting for you right now. It's linked on screen. Watch it next.
For 6 years, Ng's legal team argued before Canadian courts that extraditing him to California, where he faced the death penalty, would violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A habeas corpus petition failed. An appeal to the Alberta Court of Appeal failed. On September 26, 1991, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled 4-3 against him, and according to documented accounts of the proceeding, Canadian authorities deported Ng to California 18 minutes after the ruling was handed down. In California, Ng was indicted on 12 counts of first-degree murder. Over the years of pretrial proceedings, which stretched from 1991 to 1998, a period of nearly 7 years, Ng filed challenges against 4 separate judges assigned to his case, sued the state over his temporary detention at Folsom Prison, and was caught at Folsom hiding maps, fake identification documents, and other escape materials in his cell. He filed 25 Marsden motions, legal requests for new counsel, over the course of the proceedings. The trial itself, when it finally began in 1998 in Orange County after a change of venue, lasted 8 months and involved testimony from more than 200 witnesses. Ng's defense strategy was to place all responsibility on Leonard Lake, whom he described as a father figure he had been psychologically unable to resist. He testified in his own defense, a decision the prosecution welcomed because it allowed them to introduce additional evidence of Ng's direct participation. Prosecutors showed the jury a photograph taken inside Ng's prison cell during the pretrial period that showed cartoons Ng had sketched of his own victims displayed on the wall behind him. On February 24, 1999, the jury convicted Ng on 11 of the 12 counts of first-degree murder. Judge John J. Ryan, in rejecting a motion to reduce the sentence to life imprisonment, stated on the record that Ng was not under any duress, nor does the evidence support that he was under the domination of Leonard Lake. Ng was sentenced to death. He spent years on California's death row at San Quentin State Prison, filing federal appeals and watching the state's execution machinery freeze around him. On July 28, 2022, the California Supreme Court issued a 181-page opinion unanimously upholding his conviction and death sentence, concluding that Ng had received a fair trial and that the legal errors alleged by his appellate team did not affect the outcome. As of 2025, Charles Cheetat Ng has been transferred from San Quentin to the California Medical Facility at Vacaville as part of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's Condemned Inmate Transfer Program, which relocated death row inmates following the conversion of San Quentin's death row into a rehabilitation-focused facility. He remains condemned, his federal appeals still pending, protected from execution by Governor Newsom's moratorium for as long as it holds. He is 64 years old. The man who told Brenda O'Connor on videotape that he was cold-hearted has now spent more than 3 decades in the custody of a state that sentenced him to die and has not yet done it. And inside the walls of San Quentin during those same decades, another man was living out a different kind of waiting, one anchored not to a killing ground in the Sierra Nevada foothills, but to a single terrible night in Petaluma, California, and a 12-year-old girl who never made it home. Richard Allen Davis was born on June 2, 1954, in San Francisco, California, the third of 5 children born to Robert Davis and Evelyn Smith, 2 people who, according to documented accounts from multiple trial proceedings and press reports, were alcoholics whose relationship was defined by volatility and physical violence. Davis grew up watching adults hurt each other and hurt their children, and according to behavioral documentation compiled during his criminal proceedings, he internalized that template early. His parents separated when he was 11 years old, and his father moved the family into a house in La Honda, a small unincorporated community in San Mateo County. According to court-filed background materials, Davis had of partial Northern Paiute heritage through his maternal grandmother, Norma Wasanjani, with whom the family had lived for a time before his father relocated them. The home in La Honda did not provide the stability the separation had promised. By the time Davis was a young teenager, he was exhibiting behaviors that would, in retrospect, read as a clear escalating pattern: cruelty to animals, burglary, theft, and a documented indifference to the consequences his actions produced for other people. According to court records compiled across decades of criminal proceedings, Davis began stealing from homes before he was a teenager, and his crimes escalated with a consistency that the legal system repeatedly failed to interrupt. When he was 17, a judge gave him the choice between Army enlistment and reform school. He chose the Army and was discharged in August 1972, with his service record documenting AWOL incidents, failure to report, fighting, and morphine use, a military career that lasted less than a year and produced nothing except an early discharge and a habit. What followed his discharge was a documented criminal history of staggering consistency. According to court records and case documentation compiled across 2 decades of proceedings, Davis committed crimes ranging from burglary to assault to armed robbery to kidnapping across a period stretching from the early 1970s through 1993. On December 16, 1976, he escaped from Napa State Hospital, where he had been committed following a prior conviction, and went on a 4-day crime spree. He broke into the home of Marjorie Mitchell, a nurse at the state hospital, and struck her on the head with a fire poker while she slept. He broke into the Napa County Animal Shelter and stole a shotgun. He used that shotgun to attempt the kidnapping of a bartender named Hazel Frost as she climbed into her car outside a bar. When Frost saw that he had bindings ready and understood what was intended, she rolled out of the vehicle, retrieved a handgun she kept beneath the seat, and fired 6 shots at Davis as he fled. He was arrested 5 days later hiding in brush behind a home in La Honda. He was sentenced to prison. He was paroled. He committed more crimes. He was sentenced again. He was paroled again. Between 1975 and 1982, according to verified court records, Davis committed offenses ranging from burglary to assault to 2 separate kidnappings. He was sentenced in 1985 to 16 years in state prison for a kidnapping conviction. He was released in June 1993, 4 months before he walked into a 12-year-old girl's bedroom, on account of good behavior. He had served 8 years of a 16-year sentence. The system that held him had released him, and within 4 months of his release, Polly Hannah Kloss was dead. Polly Kloss was born on January 3, 1981, and had grown up in Petaluma, a small city in Sonoma County 40 miles north of San Francisco. She was 12 years old, described by everyone who knew her as creative, warm, and vividly alive, A girl who loved theater, who read constantly, and whose face, once her disappearance became national news, would appear on flyers across the United States and on the desk of the President of the United States. On the night of October 1, 1993, Polly was hosting a slumber party at her mother's home on 4th Street in Petaluma. Two friends, Kate McLean and Jillian Pelham, were with her. Polly's mother, Eve Nickel, had retired early to her room with a migraine. According to court records and the testimony of the two surviving girls, at approximately 10:30 p.m. a man entered Polly's bedroom carrying a knife he had taken from the kitchen of the Kloss home. He was intoxicated. He told the girls he was only there for money and would not hurt them. He bound both of Polly's friends, pulled pillowcases over their heads, and told them to count to 1,000. Then he took Polly Kloss and left the house. According to documented accounts of what followed, the two remaining girls freed themselves and told Polly's mother, who called 911 immediately. An all-points bulletin was broadcast within 30 minutes of the kidnapping. But according to investigative records reviewed at trial, the broadcast went out only over Sonoma County Sheriff's Channel 1, not across all law enforcement frequencies, a communications failure that would later prompt California to mandate that all missing children reports be broadcast across every law enforcement channel in any affected jurisdiction. Within hours of the kidnapping, a babysitter driving home in a rural area of Santa Rosa, approximately 20 miles north of Petaluma, encountered a man she did not recognize standing beside a car that had become stuck in a ditch near her employer's property. Two Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies responded to her call. They found Davis there, intoxicated, his car stuck, a stranger with no plausible explanation for his presence, and spoke with him. They filled out a field identification card and allowed him to leave. They did not detain him. The missing child broadcast that might have connected Davis to the kidnapping had not reached them. Davis drove away. For the next 2 months, more than 4,000 volunteers combed the woodlands and open country around Petaluma. The case received round-the-clock media coverage. Actress Winona Ryder, who had been raised in Petaluma, offered a personal reward of $200,000 for information leading to Polly's safe return. Mark Kloss, Polly's father, appeared repeatedly on national television, his face a document of sustained anguish, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The FBI's Crimes Against Children unit worked alongside local law enforcement in what became, by documented accounts of investigators involved, one of the largest child abduction searches in California history. Then, on October 19, 1993, 18 days after the kidnapping, Davis was arrested in Ukiah for driving under the influence of alcohol. He failed to appear in court for that charge. On November 30, 1993, he was arrested again for violating his parole, this time on the Coyote Valley Indian Reservation north of Ukiah. It was during the processing of this parole violation that investigators, reviewing his background, identified Davis as a person of interest in the Kloss kidnapping. A palm print recovered from the scene of the abduction was run against Davis's criminal record and confirmed a match. Davis was placed under surveillance. On November 28, 1993, the owner of a rural property that had previously been logged was walking her land when she discovered items she believed might be connected to the kidnapping, torn ballet leggings that were later confirmed by the FBI crime laboratory to match the leggings Polly had been wearing on the night she disappeared. A search of call records for that property revealed the field identification card filled out by the two deputies on the night of the abduction. Davis was now identified. He was placed under arrest. He initially denied knowledge of Polly's whereabouts. But on December 4, 1993, after days of interrogation, Davis confessed. He told investigators where to find Polly Kloss. Her body was in a shallow grave just off Highway 101, approximately 1 mile south of the Cloverdale city limits, buried under dense brush on a hillside 65 miles north of her home. She had been strangled. She was 12 years old. Davis's trial began on April 17, 1996, in Santa Clara County after a change of venue from Sonoma County. His defense team, led by Barry Collins, made a tactical decision that would define the entire proceedings. They admitted from the outset that Davis had kidnapped and murdered Polly Kloss. Their argument was that the killing had not been premeditated, that it had not been accompanied by sexual assault, and that the death penalty's special circumstances therefore did not apply. Prosecutor Greg Jacobs dismantled that argument methodically across weeks of testimony, presenting evidence of Davis's documented intent to commit sexual assault, the bindings he had brought to the Kloss home, and the complete behavioral record of a man whose entire documented criminal history was a sequential escalation toward the crime he had finally committed. On June 18, 1996, the jury convicted Davis of first-degree murder with 4 special circumstances: robbery, burglary, kidnapping, and an attempted lewd act on a child. On August 5, 1996, the same jury returned a sentence of death. What happened next in that San Jose courtroom became one of the most documented and publicly recalled moments in California criminal justice history. As the verdict was read, Davis stood and extended both middle fingers toward the courtroom camera. Later, at his formal sentencing, he read a statement from the dock in which he claimed that Polly Kloss's last words to him had been, in his version, "Just don't do me like my dad," an accusation that her father had molested her. Mark Kloss, seated in the gallery, attempted to physically lunge at Davis and had to be physically restrained by officers. Judge Thomas Hastings, in handing down the formal death sentence, stated on the record that Davis's conduct in the courtroom had made the decision to pass the sentence significantly easier. Richard Allan Davis was transported to San Quentin State Prison and placed on death row. In July 2006, he was found unconscious in his cell following an opiate overdose, an incident that remains unexplained in public records, raising documented questions about how a condemned inmate on California's most restrictive housing unit obtained access to opiates. He survived. He has filed multiple appeals. On June 1, 2009, the California Supreme Court upheld his death sentence, rejecting his argument that his jailhouse confession had been obtained without counsel present. In 2024, his attorneys filed a petition to recall his death sentence under recent changes to California sentencing law. The Sonoma County District Attorney's Office called those arguments nonsensical in a court filing. On June 1, 2024, a judge denied the petition. Mark Kloss was in the courtroom that day, wearing a Kloss Kids Foundation shirt, and told reporters afterward that there was no place for Davis to go except to hell. As of January 2026, Richard Allan Davis remains in the Adjustment Center at San Quentin State Prison, the most restrictive unit within the facility, reserved for condemned inmates deemed too dangerous or too high profile for standard death row housing. He has been there for nearly 3 decades. What his case produced beyond his own sentence is a matter of verified legislative record. The public outrage that erupted in the aftermath of the Kloss murder, driven in large part by the documented fact that Davis had been released from a 16-year sentence after serving only 8 years and had committed his crime within 4 months of that release, created the political pressure that produced California's 3 strikes law. Signed by Governor Pete Wilson on March 7, 1994, the law mandated a sentence of 25 years to life for any defendant convicted of a felony who had 2 or more prior serious or violent felony convictions. It was the most significant change to California sentencing law in a generation, and it was built directly on the documented history of a man who had been handed opportunity after opportunity by a system that prioritized early release over the safety of people like Polly Kloss. Mark Kloss has said in documented public statements that he intends to be present at Davis's execution if it ever occurs, and that he would bring champagne. California has not carried out an execution since January 17, 2006. The moratorium holds. Davis waits in the Adjustment Center. And what the documented record of his case reveals, across every court filing, every parole decision, every field identification card that was filled out and filed on the night a 12-year-old was taken, is that the system failed Polly Kloss not once, but at every single point where it had the opportunity to intervene. That is the unseen truth inside the Richard Allan Davis case. Not just one failure, but a documented chain of them, stretching from his first conviction in the early 1970s to the night 2 deputies let him drive away from a ditch on a rural road while a child's all-points bulletin had not yet reached their radio. Systems do not fail all at once. They fail in increments, each one small enough to excuse, each one adding its weight to the one before it, until a 12-year-old girl is buried off a highway and 30 years of litigation begin. Inside the same walls where Davis has spent those 30 years, 2 more men were living out their own sentences, men whose crimes cut through entirely different communities, by entirely different methods, with the same final destination. If this documentary is making you look at the California justice system differently, subscribe to the channel. We cover these cases in the depth they deserve. That was the story of Richard Allan Davis, and the chain of institutional failures that allowed him to reach a 12-year-old girl's bedroom in Petaluma. But inside the same walls where Davis has spent 3 decades waiting, another condemned man arrived by a completely different road, one that began not in Northern California but in Birmingham, Alabama, in a neighborhood that people who grew up there described in documented accounts as rough and unforgiving, and in a family with a criminal history that, by the time investigators began reconstructing it, read like a blueprint for what the man would eventually become. Cleophus Prince Jr. was born on July 24, 1967, in Birmingham, Alabama, the oldest of 8 children. According to documented background materials compiled across his criminal proceedings, his father, Cleophus Prince Sr., was not an abstraction in the family's history of violence. He had served time in prison for second-degree murder and had subsequently been arrested for rape, a charge that was later reduced to assault. Those who knew the family described Prince Jr. as having grown up in a rough neighborhood, the oldest child carrying the weight of a household shaped by his father's record and his community's hardness. Despite this, documented accounts from people who knew him consistently described Prince Jr. in his youth as a polite young man who had stayed away from gangs and had no criminal record prior to his enlistment. He was an average student who enjoyed sports and by multiple accounts gave no outward indication of the violence that would define him. After completing high school, Prince joined the United States Navy in 1987 and was assigned to Miramar Naval Air Station in San Diego, California. His military career lasted just over 2 years before it was ended by his own conduct. In October 1989, he was court-martialed for stealing a postal money order, sentenced to a brief term in the brig, fined $466, and recommended for discharge. He was released from the brig and within 2 months had moved into the Buena Vista Gardens apartment complex in San Diego's Claremont neighborhood, the same complex where 3 of his first victims would live. What the documented record shows about the period between his discharge and his first murder is a pattern that forensic psychologist Louis Schlesinger, speaking on the documented record, described as consistent with established research. When investigators examined Prince's behavior before the killings, they found a history of residential burglary, accomplished with accomplices who wore socks over their hands to avoid leaving fingerprints. That detail, the honeycomb-patterned sock impressions left on doorknobs, matched the bloody marks found at the scenes of multiple murders. Investigators would later document that a history of burglary appears in the background of a significant proportion of men who escalate to rape and murder, because the burglar has already learned that he can enter another person's most intimate space without consent, has already normalized the violation of boundaries, and has already developed comfort with the vulnerability of people who do not know he is there. Prince had been practicing entry. On January 12, 1990, Tiffany Paige Schultz, 20 years old, was stabbed to death inside her apartment at the Canyon Ridge complex, adjacent to Buena Vista Gardens. Her boyfriend was initially arrested and held for 3 days before being released. There was no forensic evidence to connect anyone else to the crime, and the case moved into the investigative database without a suspect. On February 16, 1990, Janine Marie Weinhold, 21 years old and a student at the University of California, San Diego, was raped and stabbed repeatedly in her apartment at a complex adjacent to Buena Vista Gardens. DNA evidence collected from the scene, semen recovered from Weinhold's clothing, was processed using the restriction fragment length polymorphism method, one of the first high-profile uses of this technique in a California serial murder investigation. The sample was forwarded to Cellmark Diagnostics for analysis. On April 3, 1990, Holly Suzanne Tarr, 18 years old and visiting her brother, was murdered at the Buena Vista Gardens complex. A maintenance worker who had seen a man fleeing the building after Tarr's death provided a description to investigators, and a composite drawing was distributed to the public in April. Prince had by this point moved out of Buena Vista Gardens and into a different San Diego apartment, but the killings did not stop. On May 21, 1990, Elissa Naomi Keller, 38 years old, was stabbed to death in her apartment at the East San Diego complex where Prince had recently moved. A gold nugget ring belonging to Keller was later traced to Prince. On September 13, 1990, Pamela Gail Clark, 42 years old, and her daughter Amber Clark, 18 years old, were murdered together in their University City home. According to documented investigation accounts, Prince had followed Pamela Clark home from a health club in the Miramar neighborhood where he worked out, a club where investigators later found, upon reviewing the sign-in sheets, that Prince, Holly Tarr's brother, and 2 victims had all been members. Prince's girlfriend, Charla Lewis, worked at the club. In the weeks following the Clark murders, Prince returned to Birmingham. Investigators in San Diego now had enough pattern evidence to characterize the killings as the work of a serial offender but had not yet identified a suspect. The Cellmark DNA results came back from the laboratory in March 1991. A definitive match to semen collected from Janine Weinhold's clothing confirmed in 1 in 120,000 odds, belonging to Cleophus Prince Jr. Birmingham police were contacted. A detective made a calculated decision. Rather than sending marked units to Prince's home, an officer called Prince by telephone and told him there was additional bail paperwork from a minor theft charge that needed to be completed at the precinct. He told Prince he would not need to send marked cars if Prince came in voluntarily. According to the documented arrest report, after 6 hours of telephone conversations, Prince walked into the Birmingham Police East Precinct with his mother and was taken into custody. He was extradited to San Diego. When detectives searched his possessions, they found knives consistent with the murder weapons and stolen jewelry, including the rare opal ring Prince had given his girlfriend Charla Lewis as a Christmas present in December 1990. The ring had belonged to Holly Suzanne Tarr. During his interrogation, according to court records, Prince denied any involvement in the killings. Incriminating statements he had made to friends and a jailhouse informant, including admissions about forcing himself on women, were later introduced as evidence at trial. The trial of Cleophus Prince Jr. became, according to documented accounts of investigators and legal observers, one of San Diego's most scrutinized criminal proceedings. The defense argued mistaken identity and challenged the forensic methodology of the DNA testing. The prosecution answered with the DNA match, the stolen jewelry, matching sock pattern impressions from crime scenes, eyewitness testimony placing Prince near multiple victim locations, and statements Prince had made to people in his own life. On July 13, 1993, the jury found Prince guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder and 21 additional felony charges. On November 12, 1993, Judge Charles R. Hayes sentenced him to death. Speaking from the dock before sentencing, Prince told the victims' families assembled in the courtroom that he had not killed any of their daughters, and that seeing the photographs of what had been done to them had hurt him as much as it hurt them. Jean Weinhold, whose 21-year-old daughter Janine had been raped and stabbed repeatedly in her apartment, told reporters outside the courtroom that she did not believe a word he said, and that she wished she could kill him herself. Judge Hayes ordered Prince transported to San Quentin within 10 days, where he became the 368th person in California awaiting execution. He has been there ever since. The California Supreme Court upheld his conviction and death sentence on May 1, 2007. Governor Newsom's 2019 moratorium suspended his execution indefinitely along with all others. As of the time this documentary was produced, Cleophus Prince Jr. remains on California's death row at San Quentin State Prison, 57 years old, still maintaining in every legal filing that the evidence against him was flawed. The DNA that matched his profile at 1 in 120,000 odds has not changed. That was the story of Cleophus Prince Jr. But inside the same walls, another condemned man arrived from a different part of California, from the Central Coast, from the woodlands of San Luis Obispo County, from the end of a dirt road where two shallow graves waited. A man whose parole officer knew something was wrong before anyone else would listen, and whose own confession answered a question that has haunted criminal justice proceedings for decades. What does a person who has done what he did say about himself when finally asked directly? Rex Allan Krebs was born in 1965 in Idaho, and his early life, according to background materials compiled during his criminal proceedings and documented in the trial record, was shaped by an alcoholic father whose violence in the home was severe enough that his defense team would later present it as mitigating evidence during the penalty phase of his murder trial. According to that documented testimony, Krebs endured serious physical abuse throughout his childhood at the hands of his father, and the psychological damage it caused was reflected in a pattern of behavior that began appearing in his teenage years and never stopped escalating. By the time Krebs was a young man, he had moved to California's Central Coast, and in 1987, at the age of 22, he committed a series of crimes against a woman in Grover Beach that revealed with complete clarity what he was capable of and what he intended to keep doing if not stopped. According to court records, Krebs broke into her home and raped her. 10 days later, he returned to the same house and attacked her again, this time with a screwdriver, severing a tendon in her hand. He was arrested, charged, convicted of rape, sodomy, assault to commit rape, residential burglary, and felony grand theft, and sentenced to 20 years in state prison. He was sent to Soledad State Prison. He served 10 years. He was released on parole in September 1997, assigned to San Luis Obispo County, and placed under the supervision of state parole agent David Zaragoza. According to documented accounts from Zaragoza himself, Krebs initially performed well on parole, securing an apartment and a job at a local lumber company within days of his release, exceeding the requirements placed on him and presenting as a man committed to rebuilding his life. Because of the nature of his prior crimes, Zaragoza conducted more supervisory checks on Krebs than on any other person in his caseload. In October 1998, Krebs was pressured out of his Atascadero neighborhood after residents learned of his past. He moved to Davis Canyon, a rural wooded area outside San Luis Obispo with no cell phone service and poor radio reception. 1 month later, on the night of November 12, 1998, Rachel and Newhouse, 20 years old and a junior nutrition major at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, left Tortilla Flats Bar and Restaurant on the corner of Nipomo and Higuera Streets and began walking home. According to court records and Krebs's own later confession, he had parked his vehicle near the Jennifer Street Bridge and waited. He was wearing a Halloween mask depicting a skull. When Newhouse crossed the bridge, he attacked her, beat her unconscious, threw her into his pickup truck, drove her to his secluded home in Avila Valley and hogtied, raped, and strangled her to death. He buried her body in a shallow grave near his property. Blood discovered on the Jennifer Street Bridge was confirmed by laboratory analysis to be Newhouse's. She was listed as a missing person. The investigation stalled. San Luis Obispo was already living under the unresolved shadow of the 1996 disappearance of Cal Poly freshman Kristen Smart, whose case had never been solved. The community's tension, as documented in press accounts and law enforcement statements from the period, was palpable. More than 180 law enforcement personnel were eventually involved in the Newhouse investigation. On March 11, 1999, while Newhouse remained listed as missing and unrecovered, Krebs struck again. Andrea Crawford, 20 years old and an interior design major at Cuesta Community College, was studying in her bedroom in her duplex apartment on Branch Street. According to Krebs's confession and the forensic evidence recovered from the scene, he had surveilled her apartment 4 to 5 times before the night of the attack. He waited until she was asleep. He tried the front door, the back door, every first-floor window and found them all locked. He then crawled through a small transom-type bathroom window, the same entry method he had used in 1987 against his first victim. When Crawford confronted him, he beat her, bound her, and carried her to his truck. He drove her to his property, raped and tortured her over the following days, and then strangled her to death with a rope. He buried her body approximately 30 feet from his front door. When Crawford's mother could not reach her daughter by phone on March 13th, she called police, who responded to the apartment and found Crawford's purse in her car, her pager inside the unit, but no keys. She was classified as a missing person. Parole agent David Zaragoza, reading a Tribune article that described the method of entry into Crawford's apartment, recognized immediately what he was reading. He told reporters years later that when the article described the point of entry as a small window, he started thinking about parolees in the county with similar methods of operation. One name came to the front of his mind immediately. Zaragoza and task force investigators conducted a parole search of Krebs's property on March 19, 1999. Under California law, a parole agent can search a parolee's residence without a warrant upon suspicion of a parole violation. During that search, investigators found a BB gun and pellets, contraband for a parolee, and an 8-ball keychain without its keys. Andrea Crawford's mother had told investigators that a distinctive 8-ball keychain belonging to her daughter was missing from the apartment. Krebs was arrested for the parole violation and taken to San Luis Obispo County Jail. Investigator Larry Hobson interviewed Krebs approximately 10 times over the following weeks. Krebs initially told Hobson he had found the keychain in the prison yard at Soledad. Hobson had already confirmed with prison authorities that such an item would have been classified as contraband and confiscated during routine cell searches. On April 22, 1999, Krebs was transported from the jail to the San Luis Obispo Police Department for another interview. According to the documented account of what followed, Krebs confessed. He provided Hobson with the full details of both kidnappings, both rapes, and both murders. He then led investigators to Davis Canyon, where he showed them the 2 grave sites. The bodies of Rachel Newhouse and Andrea Crawford were recovered on April 23 and 24, 1999, from 4-foot graves near Krebs's property. During his confession, according to the documented record of the interview, Krebs asked Hobson a question that his prosecutors would later cite at trial. "If I am not a monster, then what am I?" His trial began in 2001. Prosecutor John Trice told the jury during opening statements that what Krebs had done to these women would stagger them and make them question their basic belief in humanity. The defense argued during the penalty phase that Krebs's history of severe childhood abuse by his alcoholic father, combined with a traumatic brain injury he sustained in a bar fight 3 months before Newhouse's murder, had produced a mental state that warranted life imprisonment rather than death. The jury disagreed. In 2001, Rex Allan Krebs was convicted of kidnapping, rape, sodomy, burglary, and first-degree murder on both counts and sentenced to death by lethal injection. The California Supreme Court denied his automatic appeal on December 26, 2021, upholding his conviction and sentence in full. Governor Newsom's moratorium suspended his execution along with all others in California. As of the time this documentary was produced, Rex Allan Krebs remains on California's death row at San Quentin State Prison. The parole officer who recognized his method of entry from a newspaper article, David Zaragoza, has stated in documented interviews that he still remembers nearly every detail of those weeks. The 2 women he could not save are buried in their families' memories and in the court record of a man who asked, in his own words and on the verified record, whether he was a monster, and received his answer from a jury of 12 people in 2001. Before we get into the final 2 cases, if this documentary has held your attention, subscribe right now and hit the bell so you never miss what we release next. Cary Anthony Stayner was born on August 13, 1961, in Merced, California, the oldest of 5 children born to Delbert Foy Stayner and Kay Stayner, a family that lived in the farming town's quiet residential streets in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains and the Yosemite wilderness beyond. By every external measure, the Stayner family occupied ordinary American life. A working father, a homemaker mother, children who went to school and played in the neighborhood and grew up in the kind of place where nothing very terrible was supposed to happen. And then, on December 4, 1972, something terrible happened anyway, and from that day forward the Stayner family would never again be what it had been. 7-year-old Stephen Gregory Stayner, Cary's younger brother, was abducted outside a Merced church by a man named Kenneth Parnell and Parnell's accomplice, Irvin Murphy, who had lured him with the false claim that his mother had given permission for the boy to accompany them. Stephen Stayner would not come home for 7 years. For 7 years, Kenneth Parnell moved him from town to town across Northern California, sexually abusing him throughout, while the Stayner family launched a massive and documented search effort that generated national attention. Cary was 11 years old when his brother disappeared. According to documented psychological evaluations compiled for his defense team and filed in federal court, he had already by that age been exhibiting behavioral warning signs that preceded the kidnapping entirely, diagnosed at age 3 with trichotillomania, an obsessive-compulsive disorder manifesting as the compulsive pulling of hair, which produced visible bald spots that followed him into his school years and made him a target for bullying. According to psychiatric testimony presented at trial, Cary Stayner claimed he had begun having violent fantasies about abducting and killing women as early as age 7, predating his brother's disappearance. Those fantasies, according to the same documented psychiatric testimony, centered on restraint, control, and the sexual domination of female victims. But whatever was already present inside Cary Stayner's psychology, the 7 years of his brother's absence and the dynamics that absence created in the Stayner household poured additional damage onto an already unstable foundation. According to documented accounts from trial proceedings and the psychiatric evaluations filed in the case, Delbert Stayner, consumed by grief and desperation over Stephen's disappearance, became emotionally unavailable to his remaining children. He swung, according to the documented record, between obsessive efforts to find Stephen and episodes of suicidal depression so severe that they pulled him entirely out of the family's day-to-day life. Cary, as the oldest child, was left in a household where his parents were present physically but largely absent in every way that mattered. Then, approximately 6 months after Stephen's abduction, according to documented accounts that would emerge years later during Cary's own proceedings, his uncle Jesse Stayner began sexually molesting him. That abuse, according to documented psychiatric testimony presented at trial, continued over a period of time and compounded the psychological damage that had already begun accumulating. When Stephen Stayner finally escaped in 1980, walking into a Ukiah police station with a 5-year-old boy he had rescued from Parnell's most recent abduction, the nation responded with an outpouring of relief and celebration that descended on the Stayner household and made Cary once again invisible. Stephen's story became a television miniseries in 1989, I Know My First Name is Stephen, which aired to enormous ratings and renewed public adulation for the brother who had survived and escaped. Cary watched all of it. According to documented accounts from people who knew him, he found no way to reconcile the national celebration of Stephen's story with his own sense of having been abandoned, overlooked, and unmade by the same family tragedy that had made his brother famous. Stephen Stayner, who had married and had 2 children of his own, died in a motorcycle accident on September 16, 1989, at the age of 24. He had barely begun his adult life. His death deprived Cary of the brother he had spent years waiting to have back, and according to documented accounts from people close to Cary in that period, something in him shifted after Stephen died in a way that was visible to those around him. Not long after Stephen's death, his uncle Jesse Stayner, the man who had molested him, was shot to death inside the home they shared together on December 26, 1990. The murder was never solved. Cary Stayner was a suspect after his own arrest for the Yosemite murders years later. In 1991, according to documented accounts, he attempted to kill himself using carbon monoxide poisoning. In 1995, he was admitted to a psychiatric facility following what he described as a nervous breakdown. He was released after a brief period of treatment. In 1997, he was hired as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel in El Portal, California, situated just outside the Highway 140 entrance to Yosemite National Park. He lived in an apartment above the motel restaurant. According to documented accounts from neighbors, co-workers, and a woman whose daughter was dating him at the time, Stayner presented as a gentle, somewhat lost man who drew illustrations for the children of people he knew, bought them toys, and spoke about Yosemite with what people around him described as genuine reverence. He was, by all external accounts, a damaged but quiet man who had found something like peace in the mountains. The reality documented inside his own psychology was entirely different. According to his own statements to investigators and psychiatric evaluators, he had spent 30 years carrying violent sexual fantasies about women that had never diminished and had never been treated. He had, in his own documented words provided to the FBI during his confession, thought about killing women since he was 7 years old. He had attempted to act on those fantasies once before the Yosemite killings, unsuccessfully, and the 30 years of containment had, by February 1999, reached their end. On February 15, 1999, Carol Yvonne Sund, 42 years old, arrived at Cedar Lodge with her 15-year-old daughter Julie Sund and Julie's 16-year-old friend Silvina Palazzo, an Argentine exchange student who had been placed with the Sund family and was traveling with them through California. According to Stayner's own documented confession and the physical evidence recovered during the investigation, he identified the 3 women and began planning that evening. He approached their room with a ruse about a plumbing leak, gained entry, and executed what investigators would later describe in documented accounts as a methodical and deliberate plan of violence against all 3. According to documented court evidence and Stayner's own admissions, he strangled Carol Sund and Silvina Palazzo, placed their bodies in the trunk of the Sund's rented Pontiac Grand Prix, and drove into the mountains with Julie Sund still alive. He killed Julie Sund the following day and left her body near Don Pedro Reservoir in Tuolumne County, miles from where the Pontiac was abandoned. He drove the Pontiac to a remote area near Long Barn, California, and set it on fire with the bodies of Carol and Silvina inside. The burned-out car was discovered by hikers on March 18, 1999, and the bodies inside were identified using dental records. On March 19, FBI agents received an anonymous letter containing a hand-drawn map directing them to Julie Sund's body, which was recovered on March 25. The note, according to documented FBI accounts of the investigation, read at the top, "We had fun with this one." The author was Cary Stayner. The FBI investigation that followed became, according to documented accounts from agents involved, one of the largest ever mounted in the Yosemite area. The Bureau's investigative focus initially settled on two men with criminal histories who lived near where Carol's son's wallet had been discovered, and in June 1999 announced publicly that they had the killers in custody on unrelated charges. That announcement was wrong. The actual killer was still at Cedar Lodge, still working his maintenance shifts, and still being interviewed by FBI agents who had spoken with him multiple times as a potential witness without identifying him as a suspect. On July 21, 1999, Joa Ruth Armstrong, 26 years old and a naturalist employed by the Yosemite Institute, was at her cabin in the park's backcountry. Stayner spotted her, approached her with a gun, bound her, and attempted to drive away with her in his International Scout. According to documented accounts from the investigation, Armstrong threw herself from the moving vehicle and attempted to run. Stayner caught her. He decapitated her. Her body was found on July 22, 1999. Eyewitnesses had seen the pale blue 1972 International Scout near Armstrong's cabin the day before her death. Investigators traced the vehicle to Stayner. FBI Special Agent Jeffrey Rinneck and his partner went to the Laguna del Sol nudist resort in Wilton, California, where Stayner was staying, and brought him to Sacramento for questioning. According to Rinneck's documented account of what followed, he and Stayner made conversation during the drive. About Stephen, about Yosemite, about the family's grief, and something in that conversation opened a door that Stayner had kept closed for 30 years. During the interview, according to Rinneck's documented account, Stayner confessed, first to Armstrong's murder and then to all 4 killings. Before confessing to the San Palazzo murders, Stayner made a demand. He wanted the FBI to obtain a large collection of child pornography in exchange for his full confession. The FBI declined. Stayner confessed anyway. In a subsequent jailhouse interview with a San Francisco television station, he stated that he had been fantasizing about killing women since he was 7 years old, and that he wanted a television movie made about his life, just as one had been made about Stephen. The request confirmed what the psychological record had already suggested, that the shadow of Stephen Stayner's story had never left him, and that his own violence was entangled in his own psychology, with his brother's fame and his family's grief. His trial was held in Mariposa County in 2002. His defense team presented the documented history of his childhood abuse, his uncle's molestation, his family's dysfunction, and his 30 years of untreated violent ideation as mitigating factors warranting a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder on August 27, 2002. He was sentenced to death at San Quentin State Prison, where he remains today, 63 years old, in a cell approximately 48 square feet in size, roughly 10% larger than the footprint of a king-sized bed, according to documented accounts of San Quentin's condemned housing conditions. California has not carried out an execution since 2006. Investigators have examined Stayner in connection with at least 5 additional deaths in the region, including the 1983 disappearance of a woman named Marvin Much Hicks, whose severed arm and skull were recovered in Yosemite over the following years and whose identity was confirmed by genetic genealogy in April 2021. He has never been charged in those additional cases. That was the story of Cary Anthony Stayner, the boy who watched his brother become a national hero, the man who spent 30 years carrying a violence no one saw until it was too late, and the condemned prisoner who asked, in a television interview from a jail cell, whether anyone would make a movie about him too. And inside the same institution where Stayner has spent more than 2 decades, the final man on this documentary's list arrived by the most direct route of all. Not through years of escalating fantasy, not through the slow erosion of a damaged psychology, but through a single night of cocaine and alcohol and the catastrophic convergence of jealousy, debt, and rage in the wine country of Sonoma County. Ramon Salcido was born on March 6, 1961, in the state of Sinaloa, Mexico, the son of a family from the small city of Los Mochis on the Gulf of California. He crossed into the United States as a young man and settled in the agricultural and wine-producing communities of Sonoma County, California, where by the early 1980s he had found work as a vineyard laborer. He was, by documented accounts of people who worked alongside him and lived near him, a man of considerable physical presence. Handsome, energetic, hard-working when sober, and described by neighbors and co-workers alike as someone who could be charming and generous and, in the next moment, explosively angry. He met Angela Richards, the daughter of a staunch local Catholic family, and the two married in December 1984. Angela's family was rooted in the Sonoma Valley community in a way that Salcido, as a Mexican immigrant worker, was not, and multiple documented accounts of their relationship describe a dynamic shaped by his possessiveness, his jealousy, and his absolute unwillingness to tolerate what he perceived as threats to his authority within the marriage. 3 daughters followed their wedding in quick succession: Sophia, born in 1984, Carmina, born in 1986, and Teresa, born in 1987. The family's financial situation, according to documented records reviewed during his criminal proceedings, was deteriorating by the late 1980s. Salcido earned approximately $1,200 a month at the Grand Cru Winery in Glen Ellen, where he had secured work as a winery employee. The family had accumulated $3,000 in credit card debt.